So over the past few years, the RiverLife leadership, we've been feeling more and more that we need to revisit our strategy as a church. We're 10 years old, over 10 years old, 2 campuses. We're all older than when we were when we started, and we realized what got us here won't get us there. And so first we crafted a new mission statement. We are a next-gen Hmong church experiencing God together. And this represents a holistic faith that is at the same time experiential, theological, and communal. Now, with a new mission means we need new values. We need new values that can help us live out that mission. Because values are essential, because values tell you what you prioritize. They help you make decisions and stay laser focused to live out your mission. So over the next 6 weeks, I'll share with you our 6 new church values. And we believe that these values will carry us through, hopefully, the next decade. So here are the 6 up front. We apprentice under Jesus. We are ministers of reconciliation. We have an abundance mindset. We entrust the next generation. We are courageously transparent. And we have fun together. So this morning, we're going to begin with our first core value. We apprentice under Jesus. So a few years ago, I became curious how Hmong church folks became Christian. So I started asking people, what makes you a Christian? If you're a Christian, what makes you a Christian? And some of you, I even chatted with some of you and heard your answers. And the most common answers, maybe it was a couple dozen people, the most common answers fell into one of 2 categories. I believe in God, or I try to be a good person. Some variation of those 2. So you might think, how would you answer that question? Well, so most of the answers fell into one of these 2 camps. Fewer than half of the answers even mentioned Jesus. And then even fewer gave a more historically conventional or traditional answer like, I believe in Jesus as my Lord and Savior. That was a very small percentage of the people that I talked gave an answer like that. And you know what? These answers surprised me. I was struck by the gap between how people saw being a Christian and how the Bible talks about being a Christian. It also made me really want to come up with a clear definition of what a Christian is. So this was actually the birth of where this value came from. Because in my reading, I found a wonderful phrase from an author, John Mark Comer, called "We apprentice under Jesus," that disciples are apprentices. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, today's sermon is going to make some of you very uncomfortable. I just want to warn you on that. But you know what? I'm okay with that. Because this is important. Understanding what a Christian is, that's pretty important. So being a Christian isn't simply believing in God or even believing in Jesus. It's not trying to be a good person or doing things a Christian is supposed to do, like go to church, stop drinking, don't do this, do that. And it's definitely not simply saying you're a Christian. One day you just decide, okay, I'm Christian. But then your life kind of goes on as it is. Being a Christian is becoming an apprentice under Jesus. This involves being with Jesus, becoming like him, and doing what he did. Now, around churches, this is commonly called discipleship. But we really like this idea of apprentice because I think it's a lot clearer and it's less churchy. See, being an apprentice means learning from a mentor through close guidance over time. Now, I was a high school math teacher back in the 90s. And yes, I did once have hair, in case you were wondering. Quite glorious Southern California blonde hair. That is long gone now. I have Minnesota baldness now. But before I could become a full-time teacher, I was a student teacher. And I was a student teacher under a mentor teacher by the name of Chris Shore. I watched him teach, and he watched me teach. I stayed in his room. We ate lunch together. We shared a prep period. We even coached water polo and swimming together after school. I literally spent 8 to 10 hours a day with Chris. And that's how I learned to become a teacher. And also how I learned to coach water polo and swimming was spending time with Chris. Now, after I got hired, I worked alongside him for 5 years. And it was wonderful. He became a dear friend, and we still keep in touch today. How I teach here on Sundays is even influenced by my time with Chris as a high school math teacher. 30 years later. Now that shows the lasting impact of apprenticeship. Now, apprenticeship is not new. It's not a new idea. It's existed for ages. Even Jesus used this model with his disciples, as did all rabbis during that time. They invited the brightest teenagers in their village, in their town. Those teenage boys, the rabbis would invite them to be their talmidim, or their disciples, their followers. And these apprentices would spend all their time with the rabbi, 24/7. And they would focus on 3 things: being with him, becoming like him, and doing as he did. When Jesus began his ministry, he did that with 12 men. He did the same thing. He invited those men to be with him, to become like him, and to do as he did. And along the way, crowds started to follow, because Jesus was doing some pretty amazing stuff. He was healing, he was delivering, he was feeding. So crowds started to follow him. And Jesus would invite the crowds into this apprenticeship relationship as well. And this is what we see in our passage today. Luke 14, 25 to 35. Now, it employs a very common literary device that's important to know ahead of time. This picture, this contrast between the disciples and the crowds. Keep that in mind whenever you're reading the Gospels or listening to the Gospels. Pay attention to the disciples versus the crowds. So here's the passage, Luke 14, starting in verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees you will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So this scene is pretty typical of Jesus' ministry. He would teach, heal, deliver, and he'd draw a crowd. But crowds are not the same as disciples. Just like attending church is not the same as apprenticing under Jesus. Calling yourself a Christian isn't the same as apprenticing under Jesus. So let's break this passage down. Now, large crowds started following Jesus. So he literally turns around. And I can imagine him walking with this whole crowd behind him. He's just walking. And then all of a sudden he just stops and turns around. And he starts talking to them. And I can picture he's kind of saying, okay, crowds, you want to follow me? Well, here's what it's going to take. And then he repeats the exact same phrase 3 times in about 7 minutes of talking. The exact same phrase. If you're not willing to do blank, something, you cannot be my disciple. Jesus lays out 3 hard sayings, 3 non-negotiables of being a disciple. See, crowds don't have to do these things. 3 times he repeats the exact same phrase. If you don't hate your family and even your own life, you cannot be my disciple. If you aren't willing to carry your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. If you don't give up everything, you cannot be my disciple. Now, before we dive into each one of these, we're going to hit each one. But before we do that, let's talk about hyperbole or exaggeration. This was a very common rhetorical device for rabbis in the time. And it's common now. See, we use it all the time. See what I did there? Exaggeration. We do it all the time. I have a million things to do today. Oh, this bag weighs a ton. Black Adam was the best superhero movie. See, we use hyperbole. Jesus used hyperbole. And in fact, he used hyperbole to say that being his disciple is serious business. It takes reprioritizing your relationships. It takes unparalleled self-sacrifice. It's not what you signed up for. Jesus says you're not a disciple. You're just part of the crowd. So let's look at these hard sayings one by one. So first, verse 26 says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Now, some of you are thinking, no problem, I already hate my family. I'm in. No, that's not what he's talking about here. Okay? Jesus is not telling you or giving you permission to hate your family. See, that would violate the 5th commandment, to honor your mother and father. So what is he actually saying? Well, when a passage is unclear, one of the great things you can do is look for a parallel passage in one of the other synoptic gospels. The gospels share stories of Jesus' teaching. I actually believe Jesus repeated some of the things he taught. So you look for a parallel passage. And it's really, you could just Google that. Sometimes even in your Bible, it's in there. In the app, Bible app can show you parallel passages. So we're going to do that with Matthew 10:37. Because here Jesus is much more literal. It says, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Now that makes more sense. This is hyperbole, the hatred language. In fact, there are other parts in the Bible that use this hatred language as exaggeration. What he's really saying he says in this passage in Matthew, anyone who loves their family more than me cannot be my disciple. So this is an example of what St. Augustine described as disordered loves. When we love the right things in the wrong orders. See, it's not wrong to love your family. If you're a disciple, it is wrong to love your family more than you love Jesus. But you see, this isn't just your family. This isn't just the people in your family. It applies to your family values. It applies to your family practices. If you look and act more like your parents, then you're not living as an apprentice under Jesus. You're living as a byproduct of your parents. And Jesus calls you to be a byproduct of him. The next hard saying that he says was this: whoever does not carry their cross and follow me, figuratively dying to yourself, your ways, your wants, your desires. And in some parts of the world, this actually means literally dying. The famous author Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he writes this: when Christ calls a man or woman, he bids them come and die. Is that what you thought being a Christian was? Maybe that's not what they told you, but that's what being a Christian is. The invitation is to come and die. It is not when Christ calls a man or woman, he bids them come to church, or he bids them be a good person, or he bids them call yourself a Christian. That's not what being a disciple, being an apprentice under Jesus really is to mean. But being a disciple, being an apprentice under Jesus, means dying to yourself every single day. We don't get to decide. We don't get to define being a Christian. There are a lot of things in our world that we can self-define. We have self-defined geniuses on the internet. We have self-defined good guys who might not be so good. You can define a lot of things yourself. Being a Christian is not one of those. Jesus defined that, and this is one of his definitions. You die to yourself. And dying to yourself is absolute surrender to God. So are you willing to walk a path of dying? Christianity is not something you sign up for success. Christianity is not something you sign up for death. That's what being a Christian is. That's what Jesus calls us to do. Are you willing to walk along that path, carrying your cross, a universally known instrument of execution during his time? And are you willing to walk that path alongside Jesus? If you're not a disciple. You're just part of the crowd. Now the third saying. The third hard saying was this. And he got personal. Notice the language. Before, it was if someone. Now he says, those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciple. And I can imagine sort of the shock. Like, that was much more uncomfortable, wasn't it? When he calls you out, not when someone. This one is about what it will cost you to follow Jesus. Spoiler alert, everything. That's what it costs. Now, before Jesus said this, he presented two illustrations, two hypothetical metaphors, to illustrate the risks of carelessly jumping into something. And in this case, discipleship. Carelessly jumping into discipleship without first understanding the demands, the costs that it will place on your life, your decisions, your words, and everything else. So this first illustration was about a builder who had to make sure he had enough money to build his tower. And the second was about a king going to war who had to make sure that his army could defeat the enemy's army. If not, calls for peace, waves the white flag. See, both of these scenarios and what they have in common, the disastrous outcomes of poor planning or unrealistic expectations. Now, we would agree with both of those stories if you knew an actual architect who determined he didn't have enough money, or if you knew a general who was planning to go to war. We would agree with those. And yet, somehow with the Christian faith, when faith gets hard, we compromise, we check out, or we just quit. How many of you have known someone who just stopped going to church when life got hard or they got too busy? Maybe that was you. Maybe there's been a point in your life where you just kind of gave up on church. Didn't necessarily give up on God, but if you're honest with yourself, you probably slipped back into the crowd versus the disciples. Or how many of you know a family that went back to shamanism because the pastor's prayers didn't work to heal their child or their grandma when it's easy or convenient? So about 15 years ago, when I was considering full-time ministry, I developed a little mantra for myself. And over these years, I've told myself this thousands of times. My life is not my own. I would repeat that. When things got hard and I wanted to quit, I would say my life is not my own. When things got hard or weird or difficult or painful, my life is not my own. That means there's nothing in my life that I can't be willing to give up to God. Now, I don't get that right all the time. I wish I did. I'm happy if I could nail that half of the time. But that's what this saying of Jesus is all about. Those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciples. Another way to think of that, give up anything. Doesn't mean you will, but if God calls you to it, you have to be willing. If that's not your view of being a Christian, you're not a disciple. You're just part of the crowd. So where do you find yourself today? Where do you find yourself? Are you part of the crowd? Curious, but unwilling to commit? Unwilling to do what it takes? Or are you truly apprenticing under Jesus? Willing to reprioritize your relationships? Willing to die to yourself every day? Willing to surrender everything, anything to Him? See, Jesus didn't mince words. Discipleship isn't easy or convenient. It's costly. It's a call to live a life radically different and be unchanged. That's not discipleship. You're just part of the crowd. See, this is a call. The call of Jesus is an invitation to be radically transformed, to be with Jesus, to become like Him and do as He did. But here's the paradox. When you give everything to Jesus, you don't lose. You gain. You gain purpose, joy, a relationship with the one who gave everything for you. So this week, I want to challenge you to reflect on these hard questions. And I want you to ask yourself, and these questions are actually in your bulletin as well. You want to spend some time journaling, maybe talking around the dinner table, talk about it in your Bible study. So I want you to ask yourself, are there relationships, family values, or behaviors in my life that I render so I can carry my cross daily? And then what would it look like for me to be willing to give up anything, and maybe even everything, to follow Jesus? Jesus isn't looking for fans or crowds. He's looking for disciples. Crowds come to get something from Jesus. Disciples, they come to get Jesus. Are you here to get something from Jesus? Or are you here to get Jesus himself? Will you step out of the crowd? Will you step out of the crowd and into Jesus, to a life of apprenticing under the Master? Now, as we close, remember this. Jesus doesn't call us to this life of discipleship to burden us, but to free us. Experience the abundant life he promised. This is a life of intimacy with him, of transformation, of joy, and a legacy that will ripple through generations. And that's why our first church value is around here, we apprentice under Jesus. And I close with the mic drop statement from Jesus himself. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.